Well, we are so excited to be in conversation with you this evening. I'm Judy Lubin, founder and principal of the Center for Urban and Racial Equity. We are in a profound moment of change and transformation, and we are in a moment of hope and opportunity, and that's what brings us together this evening. I'm really looking forward to the conversation that we'll be having, not just today, but we're kicking off a series of conversations on Black community development or conscious community development. I'm so excited to be in partnership with Ron and the Network for Developing Conscious Communities. This is a moment of partnerships, right, where we have to link together in ways that we haven't been linked and connected together if we are really going to create the type of transformative and sustainable change that we need to see for our communities and for Black people in particular. So Ron, I'm going to turn it over to you to welcome and to set the occasion before we hear from our master storyteller to help us continue to set the tone for our webinar series.
Well, thank you, Judy. I am very excited myself, as with you, that we're able to join ourselves together to co-host this webinar series. And as you were reading off and looking where folks are traveling from virtually, I am really elated to see the outreach across the country in terms of folks willing to and open to participating in this kind of dialogue this evening. I want to just take a moment for all of us to take a moment and just in silence and give out good thoughts and prayers to the passing of two icons, not just Black icons, but they were universal icons in their work for justice and freedom, and their dedication to that work for so many years. And I'm speaking of Congressman John Lewis and Reverend C.T. Vivian. So let's take a moment in silence and give our love and prayers as they travel on to join with the ancestors. Thank you. Well, we're going to pass this mic back and forth between Judy and I, and so you'll get a chance to hear both of us as we work to lead this conversation this evening. So I'm going to pass the mic back to Judy in outlining the goals of the webinar and sort of lay out some of the objectives why we're here today.
Thanks, Ron. So I just want to, acknowledge that we are in a moment of reckoning, a reckoning with the past and a reckoning of the present day deeply ingrained systemic racism that has defined Black life in America. It has been a difficult couple of months for all of us, right? Particularly, to see George Floyd murdered on the streets of Minneapolis. But even in the course of a pandemic, police brutality doesn't stop, and systemic racism doesn't stop. And so, and in this COVID-19 pandemic, it's been clear, right, that the racial inequities have been laid bare, particularly as we look at the impact that COVID-19 has been having on Black communities all across the country. But in this moment, we have also seen an opening and a window to have real serious conversations about race, and not just conversations, but conversations that we hope will lead real change, we're seeing an unprecedented level of interest in understanding what systemic racism is. We're hearing, at least from our side at CURE, hearing from organizations, from corporations, from institutions that want to understand what the work is that's required in order to dismantle racism within their own institutions and within their practices, particularly those institutions that are on the front lines, that are serving our Black and Brown communities, but know that they can do better and know that they have to do better. So yesterday we were talking about how we wanted to start off the conversation, and Ron said we needed to start this conversation with some spirit. And Baba C, Baba C came to mind. So last year, CURE, the Center for Urban and Racial Equity, we hosted a storyteller event in recognition of 1619, 400 years of Black resilience and resistance, and 400 years of oppression that we are fighting every day to dismantle. And Baba C was one of our storytellers, and so I'm so grateful that Baba C is here to join us to help us open up and create the space for us to have the conversations, recognizing that there's been a lot of loss and grief, but also we're in a moment of hope and opportunity and transformation as well. The Honorable Baba C is a griot and master storyteller. Baba C has been telling stories for over 40 years. He's performed all over the US. He performs in all types of settings, even on GoToWebinar. We can't be in person. Baba C is here with us. Thank you so much, Baba C. Welcome.
You're making me blush. It's kind of difficult to see, but you're making me blush. But thank you. Don't stop. So I'm glad to be in a webinar. I think this is my first official webinar. However, due to the current situation, I was able to teach storytelling 10 classes in the last 2, maybe 3 weeks. So I'm very happy about that. You can teach a seasoned person new technology. So I'm learning that. I have 2 stories I want to share this evening. One's about conflict and one is the opposite. And this story has many variations. It's told throughout the continent of Africa. It's told in South America, throughout the islands of the American islands and the United States, particularly in the South. So I'm going to take 2 characters. I'm going to take Brer Rabbit and Brer Fox. And this is a story about why people fight. And when this first story was first told, it was told, here we go, a long time ago. Now, back in the day, the first people were the animals. And then the other people came along, the humans. And the humans were always fighting. So one day, Brer Rabbit turned to Brer Fox. He said, I don't get it. I don't get it. Why are people always fighting? Brer Fox said, you want to know why people fight? Follow me, follow me, follow me. So Brer Rabbit followed Brer Fox. And Brer Fox got to a trap where a deer had been trapped and hung upside down. And unfortunately, the deer had expired. Well, not unfortunately for the hunter. Brer Fox said, watch this, watch this, watch this. And Brer Fox took the deer down. He said, follow me, follow me, follow me. And Brer Rabbit followed Brother Fox as he dragged the deer down to the shore. And when he got there, he said, watch this, watch this, watch this, watch this. And Brer Rabbit went over to where there had been a trap set to catch a mess of fish. Now, a mess of fish is always more fish than you can eat. But he caught a mess of fish. He says, watch this, watch this. I'm going to show you. I'm going to show you. I'm going to show you why people fight. So he took the mess of fish in the net and he put the deer in the empty net, and then he dragged the mess of fish all the way back to where the deer had been caught, and he tied the mess of fish up in the deer trap. Well, the hunter came along and said, "Someone's stolen my deer." And then he saw the drag marks, and he started following the drag marks. In the meantime, the fisherman went, someone done stole my mess of fish. So he started following the drag marks, and they met in the middle. And they both said, "You stole my," well, I can't do both at the same time. "You stole my deer." "No, you stole my fish." "No, you stole my deer." "No, you stole my fish." And the next thing you know, fists were welling and a welling and a welling. If you don't know what a welling is, that means a beat down. Well, the fox turned around to the rabbit and said, that's why people fight. You see, fights often get started from misunderstandings, lack of information, assumptions. There's a reason why the first syllable of that word is ASS. Assumptions, and not particularly wanting to understand what's going on, but you want your way, or your feelings are hurt, and so you disregard everything else because you must be right. It's not always important to be right, but it is important to listen and to communicate. And if people listen and communicated, they wouldn't necessarily agree all the time, but maybe there would be less fights. That's the lesson of why people fight. The other story is a little bit different. This story is about Ubuntu. Now, if you don't want to know what Ubuntu is, you will by the end of the story. Now, this story, there's a lot of different versions of how the story got started. But basically, there was a person not of African origin who was traveling through the continent of Africa and testing people with his social experiments. And one day he saw a group of children, and they were in South Africa. He saw a group of children, and they were playing, having a lot of fun, la 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 la. But you get the point. And they were having fun, and he went to them. He said, "Children, let me have your attention for a minute." And he took a basket of fruit and candies and sweets, and he set it under a tree. And he said, "The first one to reach the tree has the basket of fruit and sweets. It's all yours." And he sat back. And to his amazement, the children went shoulder to shoulder or arm to arm, and they danced and they pranced and they jogged over to the tree as one and sat down, and then started sharing the fruits and the sweets and the candies. The non-African walked over to him. No. You were supposed to run, and the first one to get here would get all the fruits and sweets. And the children said almost in unison, "Ubuntu." He said, "What? Ubuntu. How can one of us be happy if all of us are not happy? If only one has the fruits and the sweets, the rest of us will be sad. So we share." Ubuntu is the spirit of sharing. Ubuntu is the spirit of coming together. Ubuntu is the spirit of not allowing your neighbor to starve when you have a plenty. Ubuntu is looking after everyone and treating everyone as family. Ubuntu. I hope that you gathered and learned something from that, because griots teach with the stories that we tell. Asante Sana, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob.
Pleasure is mine.
Thank you for blessing us with your gift of storytelling and the message of Ubuntu. And when you mentioned Ubuntu, I started thinking about Ron, when you talked about the purpose of this webinar, when we've been talking over the past couple of weeks. The purpose of this webinar series is that you wanted to have kitchen table type conversations, right? Where, you know, we're not disconnected. We feel a sense of connection, even though we are apart in physical locations, that we want to be able to come together and have real conversations, even difficult conversations that need to be had. And so, Ron, I'd love for you to talk a bit more about your vision for the series and what you're hoping we will be able to, at the end of the series, right, that we'll have some clear principles and goals in mind, particularly in the context of thinking of Black ecosystems and community development.
Yes. Well, thank you, Judy. I'm reminded again of Congressman John Lewis, who, as a young man, committed himself to a struggle of equality, a struggle of demonstrating love in the work that he did and the people he connected with. And so, as I'm reminded of all the outpourings that I've have been hearing, what resounds to me is this young man who carried throughout his life wanting to see the world a better place. And so, one of his quotes that have become now immortalized with John is the "get in good trouble, necessary trouble." And so, that good trouble quote really resounds to me in terms of the work that's going on now with the young protesters demanding change, but also the work that has gone on over the last 400 years in the African American community in terms of from enslavement through the walks of emancipation to Reconstruction to Jim Crow to segregation to this point we're at now. And so my vision has always been to work towards equality, but not just equality, to work towards how we move a thought around being equitable and sharing the resources that we all have been afforded here as stewards. And so I want to just give a definition this evening to conscious community development. I know we shared it on our marketing material for this webinar, but it's a term that came to me as a part of my spiritual walk, and I want to recite what to you how I define conscious community development, which is a principle-based structural practice that intentionally includes a defined, agreed understanding of ownership, wealth building, and prosperity. It's inclusive. It's in this thinking as well as participatory as a process. But you're working to elevate indigenous communities of color to the highest potentiality of conscious demonstration. So what does that mean and how does that affect the work that we all are doing? I think if you have some key words in your practice as an organization or even in your own personal walk, that you look at sharing ownership with others, that you look at building prosperity for others, that you're inclusive in how you approach others, and you want to gather participatory inclusion in that process, and you're always working to elevate others to their highest potentiality, then you're working in the realm of conscious community development. And so tonight, yes, we're having conversations, but my hope is that as everyone walks away with this, folks walk away with a renewed re-examination of the work that we all are doing. Bernard Rustin had a quote that I just recently came across, which said that we need in every community a group of angelic troublemakers. And I thought on that. He said we need in every community a group of angelic troublemakers. And so for me, that means that if we're going to get to this good trouble that John Lewis had pointed out to all of us, then yes, we're going to have to shake the tree. And we're going to have to shake up things and make even those who are comfortable uncomfortable around the thought of being equitable, being fair, and being people who have a principle about the work that we're doing. We've moved into space here this year now with this coronavirus, this pandemic that has now consumed all of our lives. But for some of us, the pandemic has been one of continuation for many, many years. Many, many years. And so while we know there's an economic impact as a result of this pandemic, there's a spiritual impact that has also been labeled upon a group of people. You know, now we're realizing in the space of community development what trauma really means, and that we have to really look at trauma as a part of the work that we do. Even while we're doing affordable housing, we're doing small business, we're doing cultural arts, but trauma has weaved its way inside all the work that we're doing now. Economic stresses, social stresses, personal stresses, and of course, all the institutional stresses that come with racism that has had its knee on a group of people for so long. So as I told my colleagues in this walk, that it's good to have folks standing in solidarity with you, but I would prefer that we all get active in this change that needs to take place in this moment in time that we're in. So, so I want to just echo that out as we move forward. Again, I want us to have this kitchen table conversation. Judy didn't mention, but we're going to open up the mic for the last half an hour of this webinar, because we want to hear your thoughts and what you have to share in this conversation. So I'm glad to see that everybody's coming from different parts of the country, from different communities, and I want to be able to learn and grow as a result of your experiences as well. So I want to just frame that with the opening this evening. So we're going to move quickly. We're going to try to our best to stay on schedule, and so we want to move now into some of this deep dive conversation. Over the next week, we'll be focused on some real dedicated conversation. But today we want to lay out some landscape and have you engage that landscape in your cultivation with us. So I want to just lay out some work that I've done as an adjunct professor at the university, and I teach in a Africana Studies department. And a couple years ago, I went back in one of my classes and pulled up some old readings that I had read as an undergrad. And one of the pieces that I pulled up to reread again was the Kerner Commission report. I don't know if everyone's had a chance to read that, but if you haven't, go back and read that Kerner Commission report. It was published right after the 1967 riots in Detroit, and President Johnson at that time commissioned this commission to go in and study what the root causes were of that outbreak in Detroit. And so a couple of things they came away with as they did their work on that Kerner report. And one of the things they noted that there were some bad policing practices that were going on in Detroit at that time. They also recognized there was a flawed justice system that was operating in Detroit. There was unscrupulous consumer credit practices that were going on. Poor and inadequate housing was also one of the things that they had noted. Of course, at that time, Detroit had a high unemployment rate in the Black community. There was voter suppression. And then there was culturally embedded forms of racial discrimination. And when you look at these items I've just noted, I said, wow, this is a drop rate into today's protests. So this was a report that was done in 1968. And here we are in 2020, and we're still at the same space. The panel also reported in their report, in their findings, that white society was deeply implicated in the development of the ghetto in Detroit. The white institutions created it, white institutions maintained it, and white society condoned it. But more importantly, one of the things that they did come away with too, they noted that there was a fracture in American society, that we had evolved to two societies, one black and one white. And so if you think in terms of community and community development and the ecosystem of community, you can see the fracturing has gone on for a number of years. So I do want to just, also give some definition around ecosystem and what that really means. And so if we think of plants, we know that in plant life, we need some certain things for plants to grow. We need nutrients in the soil, we need water, and we need sunlight to create the photosynthesis. And so when we talk about community development, what is important to creating ecosystems and communities that are vibrant economically and that are allowing communities to grow? So what we have come to understand is that it's a complex relationship of organizations working in a physical environment, such as a community, that have an interrelational relationship with each other. So by example, if you're a nonprofit housing developer developing affordable housing, then you would need a lender to provide the financing, and then you would need a group to provide counseling in terms of preparing that individual for home ownership. And so those are the interrelationships around a housing production system. Just as an example. So where does that bring us today in terms of what we've learned from the past? And I would argue today that if we look back over the last 60 years and look at the practices that have taken place in government, we're seeing the diffusion of communities. Redlining has discriminatory lending practices have been very paramount in terms of how communities have developed. I had the opportunity to meet Richard Rothstein early this year in Austin, Texas, and he shared a lot of conversation with me in terms of why he wrote the book that he wrote. It was actually by accident that he wrote the book Color Law. It wasn't intentional. Richard was doing work in education, and he was writing policies around education. But what he began to discover as he was writing his policy work around education is that it had a lot to do with where people lived. The school system was predicated upon taxes and revenue. And so as he delved deeper into the subject matter, he uncovered the practices that were orchestrated by local governments in terms of zoning practices that relegated people of color, particularly African Americans, to certain parts of cities. And of course, more he delved, the more he saw the relationship with government in that whole practice. So it brings us today, in terms of looking at communities, and particularly communities of color, in terms of what's not there and what should be there, and then how do we start to build capacity within communities and between community organizations to actually carry on the work that they need to do. And that work we're talking about, which sometimes and all the time is always faced with the institutional and structural practices of racism that has operated at a very efficient level in this country here. And so, yes. So I wanted to frame tonight's conversation around the start with the current report. And Judy, I want you to chime in too, because you work with a lot of local governments, housing authorities in the work that they do. And we know that housing authorities came about in the 30s, and they were actually, their initial development was to provide housing for working folks as a first start. Somewhere in that whole paradigm, it became housing that not only didn't didn't provide a pathway for folks to move out of public housing, but also became almost systemically placed that people continue to live there without opportunities to grow into upward mobility because of the lack of wealth that they weren't afforded. So you want to make some comments to your work that you're working with around the racial equity work that you're working with with local governments?
Yeah, thanks, Ron. So we do quite a bit of work, particularly with affordable housing providers and community development organizations, largely in part because of the importance of housing and how housing was a key mechanism for and continues to be a key mechanism for structural racism. And so it's critical that we address the deep inequities in housing in this country, because it is, as I said, one of the primary ways in which systemic racism operates in this country. And another reason why we work so closely with housing developers is because they are serving our communities. They are providing a core service, right? A basic human right, which is, access to housing. And what we're finding with affordable housing providers, many of them that we've worked with, is that there's so much work to be done, both internally in terms of dismantling institutional racism in their internal practices, as well as externally in terms of how they serve the tenants in the properties and housing that they provide, but also even in terms of, are they even thinking of themselves as part of an ecosystem, right? Which is so critical, right? That we can't have housing properties and homes and communities, right? Housing communities, and those housing communities not be connected to the communities in which they sit and operate in, right? And so a key part of the work that we do is to walk housing providers through an analysis of who they are and who they serve, their historical roots, right? The historical roots, most housing, especially some of the larger ones in our cities, right? They have a direct connection and founding in the 60s and the 70s during the height of the civil rights movement, right? And recognizing that housing was so fundamental and that there were so many inequities in terms of housing. And that many of them have become disconnected from that history, disconnected from the grassroots movements from which they emerged, right? And so, part of this moment is for us to reconnect to that movement, right? Like, this moment is asking us to look at everything through the race of lens, because everything has been looked at and shaped through the race of lens, through the lens of race and racism. And so sometimes those are hard conversations, because when we look at the leadership within many of our housing and community development organizations, they don't look like us. There aren't Black people in the leadership positions. There aren't Black, Indigenous, people of color sitting in leadership oftentimes, right? And that leadership is often predominantly white. And so what does that say about what we believe about self-determination, right? That folks who are closest to or most impacted by the problems should be leading, should be at the table, should be directing the solutions. And so, you know, like I said, these are hard conversations to have, because there's a fundamental transformation in how we think about how work gets done that needs to happen, and who does the work, right? That it's no coincidence that when we look in the leadership level, when we look at the folks who are making decisions about financing, who are making the real estate investment decisions, oftentimes those are completely white departments within some of the mid-sized and larger housing and community development organizations. And then when you get to those folks who are providing direct services, that's when you tend to see a little bit more representation of people of color.
Yes. You know, you raised a very important point around capacity and the lack of capacity building that goes on in Black and brown communities. And that is one of the things that one of the areas that we've been focusing our attention on over the last 4 years at the organization is, how do we build capacity? How do we build capacity where there is no framework in place in many of these communities? When you think about the organizational ecosystem that's operating in Black and brown community, it's reminiscent of the food deserts, where you don't have, you know, adequate access to food, but yet you don't have organizations operating in communities that can be buffers or institutions building capacity for community through bringing in services and educational means and being the advocate on the front line. And so I said earlier, where groups now have to, who are working need to now redefine their work. When you talk about being a housing developer, you have to talk about wealth building, because if people don't have the access to the means, they're not going to be able to afford a house, an apartment, no matter what the cost is. If they don't have the access to the resources, it becomes unaffordable. Particularly when you look at the burden that comes down on individuals in terms of the cost of living. I took my students through an exercise. The last 3 classes I've taught, I've taken them all through this exercise of asking them, what does the average liberal arts undergrad make coming out of college? And they give me a number, and I start backing out what that means in terms of housing costs, transportation costs, food costs, health costs. By the time that you get to the end of their costing out, they're upside down, and believe me, they're impoverished.
Mm-hmm.
They may have a degree, but they're right there with others in terms of not having the means to live full and healthy lives. You know, in this whole conversation about conscious community development, I think that, you know, one of the things that we have to be able to do is look at how we do this work. Black home ownership is about 42% nationwide. And we know one thing about home ownership: it builds neighborhood stability. It builds investment into communities. But when you, as a developer, are using a rental model over a home ownership model in a community that's already below the national average of home ownership and stability, you're working in contrary to building strong, viable communities. Now, that doesn't say that we don't need rental housing, but we know what the benefits of home ownership does. It brings an individual in, as an investor into the community. It makes them a frontliner already. They're gonna take an interest in whether the public services are adequate or not. They're gonna build the tax base. They're gonna build involvement in the schools, because they're invested. And that doesn't say that renters aren't invested, but when we talk about neighborhood stability and building wealth, home ownership is the first avenue towards that wealth building platform, that neighborhood stabilization platform. And so I argue all the time that yes, there are rental models that we can start to look at a little differently, like rental financing models that we can convert to home ownership models, such as cooperative housing. And I don't think we do enough looking at how cooperative housing can be used to build wealth and opportunity within low to moderate income neighborhoods of color. We're beginning to explore it more in the DC and in the Baltimore market, how we can do it. We're going to have some workshops later on, but I think that we got to get more as groups, more expansive, more innovative in the work that we're doing. Because a lot of the work that we're doing, and this is what this coronavirus has told us, if anything more, it has not worked. And so we can't go back to what was happening before March, when we had to shut down this area and nearly shut down the country in March. We have to now look at how can we be more innovative, out the box thinkers, and start to move something different going forward. And that is really what a part of our challenge is now. How do we move going forward? How do we start to look at redesigning and reimagining our communities, particularly our Black communities, given all the factors of disparities that are happening in these communities. So I want to move on and because I want to make sure that we're mindful enough to give our participants a chance to weigh in. One of the things that happened in 1977, and I'm going to go back to look at some, again, 1977, I mentioned 68 in Detroit and the current commission report, but I want to talk about 1977, because in 1977, Jimmy Carter, under his administration, came up with the Community Reinvestment Act. Now, this act was prompted by the redlining that banks were doing in communities of color. Unfortunately, when the legislation was crafted, it didn't talk about race discrimination. It talked about having to serve the credit needs of low to moderate income residents living in neighborhoods. But it was a initiative that should have accented more around race, because that's what was happening. That's what the banks were doing. And that's what the banks have continued to do. We know that based on your color, you still are going to pay more of an interest rate on card notes, insurance, where you live. All these things are still tied to race. And so we haven't gotten around that whole big elephant in the room called race. And so here we have now in this area of CRA that has manifested since the 1970s. Over the last 6 years, banks have contributed about $84 billion to community benefit agreements. I was astounded to hear that number, $84 billion that have been negotiated on behalf of low to moderate income communities. And I asked myself the question, which was one similar question I asked in Baltimore during the 2015 Freddie Gray uprising is, where did the money go? In 4 years, $84 billion have been raised to support housing, mortgages, small business development, philanthropic use. And where did it go? Where did it go? Because many of these communities that these banks are operating are still in despair economically. And so I think that, one of the things I like to see happen as Bayard Rustin said, we need in every community a group of angelic troublemakers. I think we have to shake the tree up, because accountability doesn't come without some risk attached to it. And we have to really talk about holding each other accountable. I'm reminded of a story doing one of Oprah's master classes that I heard from one Sunday. I was looking at Maya Angelou, and she was talking about a party she had at her home, and she was being a gracious host, going through the home, serving hors d'oeuvres and refreshments, and she came upon listening to a conversation from a gentleman who was there in a small circle, talking very negative about gays. And so, being who she was, she approached the gentleman and told him to get his coat, and he had to leave because she told him that she doesn't tolerate that kind of behavior in her home. And so I'm quite sure, I don't know if he was a invited guest or a guest of someone, but that accountability that she displayed is the kind of accountability that we have to now echo out in the work that we do. We can no longer see wrong and call it right because of friendships and relationships. We have to call it out based on our moral convictions that we know it's wrong. And we got to hold people to a high standard around that. And so that's a very uncomfortable space to be in, particularly when that person—
We do it all the time at Cure.
particularly when that person is somebody that you've known for a while. And all of a sudden you have to really call them out. But
yeah, and that's something, you talk about capacity building, right? Like that even is an individual level capacity and a collective capacity that we have to build, right? Yeah. Because oftentimes, particularly when we're, in the space of housing and community development, right? Who has the money and the power, right? And because of that, that can set up a relationship, right? Where if I need money from this funder and I know their practices are questionable, that they don't respect our communities, do I have the courage to call them out, knowing or fearing that might affect whether we get this funding or not?
Yes. Yeah, I think consciously one has to make a conscious decision where they're going to be at, and more importantly, who are they going to become? And I'm quite sure at some point in time, a lot of decisions were made based on survival. But as Harriet Tubman said, I could have freed more slaves if they knew they were slaves. And so I say that to say this here, that we're at a critical point in time now, that we all are being asked, as Michael Jackson said, to look in the mirror and ask ourselves the question: am I working for an organization that doesn't have a racial equity framework? Is it helping to build wealth, or is it extracting wealth from communities? These are now the questions of today. There's no longer a wall to hide behind. There's no longer a brick you can hide behind. It's now being transparently communicated. for all of us. And so the foundations that are operating, I just read something recently. I did a op-ed recently with Stanford University talking about the disparities of and how foundations look at Black leaders. There's a distrust there among because first of all, they don't spend time to get to know you, and they develop a perception about who you are. So when you talk about having trust, it's already dismantled at the beginning. And unless they are willing to come out of their comfort zones and ask questions of you, or at least ask others who may know you, they never get to know you. And so that's some work that the foundations are going to have to do around their program managers and certainly around their board of directors. I think I just recently saw on the news some white gentleman stepped off a board. He said, I don't want to serve on this board. He gave his board slot to an African-American male. And I commend that, because he made a conscious decision to say, listen, this organization can't grow anymore with another white male. Pick somebody in my space that can elevate this business to another level of representing some diversity in thought, in presence. So I took my took that off. I took that to mean a lot, because again, we don't need in our community any folks standing with us in solidarity. We need folks who actually now about working and making some commitment to changing this paradigm. We have
and we're starting to see, Ron, and we're starting to see some shifts in philanthropy. Still a lot more work to be done, but I think particularly coming out of the first wave of the Black Lives Matter movement, activists were saying, to foundations, if you want to support us, support us. Don't try to direct how the money is spent. Trust Black communities, trust Black leadership, that we know what to do with the funds. And so you're starting to see some of that shift, to what's called trust-based philanthropy. We are curious a beneficiary of funding that is very much hands-off. Sometimes we're asking, like, you sure you don't want to report? But that's been the relationship, right? In the past was that, all of this extra labor that was added to organizations, especially the small Black community-based organizations that often don't have the capacity to be sending out monthly or quarterly reports. And so, part of shifting philanthropy is recognizing how you can be burdening groups that are underground and need to be focusing on being in partnership, on serving and meeting the immediate needs of the communities in which they're serving, versus, sitting there and having to prepare reports, and those reports being something that is representative of whether the foundation is going to support me next year. So we do want to invite folks to drop in your questions and your comments as well. We have one question that has come in from Jerry. Jerry's asking about what happens when you have Black leadership, say as a mayor or a city leader of a housing authority, and we still have the status quo, limited affordable housing or clustered public housing. So one, when we're talking about the trajectory that led us to where we are today, right? That these changes don't happen overnight, right? And often can't. You can see some significant amount of change in one term, but not always the case. But oftentimes these are, decisions are made in part of the ecosystem in which a Black leader may operate within. But when we talk about a racial equity framework, it's a racial equity framework is something that not only that we want white folks to understand what it means to practice racial equity and to be about racial justice, but oftentimes Black folks, people of color that are in leadership, also have to do some work around racial equity and racial justice as well, and unpacking internalized racism, right? Because oftentimes we've seen this show up in terms of how leadership of color may think about Black communities, right? And so there's a whole transformation that needs to happen where we're really centering the experiences of Black community, of Black communities, where we really commit to no more business as usual, right? So we often, yeah, I think we're going to talk more about this in the next few webinar series, but there's a whole set of practices around urban planning and development that you can bring in a person of color in leadership, but they are still operating within the system of white supremacy and white dominant cultural practices, right? Such that you can switch out people, but if the system and the structure is still the same, then we continue to reproduce the same processes and the same outcomes. And so that is why, you know, we're calling for a complete system transformation, that it's not enough to have a Black leader in power or in a position of authority, because you can hamstring that person if you're still stuck within the same systems and structures that produce a racial inequality to begin with.
Yeah, it's like moving chess pieces. That's all, and that's what you're doing. It's just replacing one people, but the system is still embedded in itself. Someone spoke about this even with the police departments around the country. The system that's operating. So when you bring a Black officer in, yes, he's a Black police officer, but he's operating already in a system that's already structurally in place. And so how does he manifest himself through? How did he manage himself through that system? I would also just want to add to what Jerry's question is, that strengthening the ecosystem in community is very critical. I think sometimes we sometimes have forgotten the power of community and what it means when we can mobilize and organize community to hold accountable our elected officials, be they Black or white. And without an organized body in community that we can bring along with us, the effort of trying to make those changes that we're talking about sometimes falls short. And so there's a process to bring community along. We have to continue to organize and educate folks to what are the issues and how we need them to participate in this participatory process. And I want to say that there is a process called participatory budgetary management. And I just want to, it's operating right now in Jackson, Mississippi, where the community has said that they're going to make decisions about how the city spends its money. No longer will the city arbitrarily say we spend money on this, we'll spend money on this line items without community input. So that participatory budgetary process is operating in Jackson, Mississippi, is now being moved by the community. And so, yes, I know that, you know, some of the work that we all doing takes us out of our comfort zone realm, because if you talk about doing small business or housing, organizing is something that you don't normally do. But we can't move communities until we organize communities. And so we have to understand that the connectedness will continue to organize and move folks along this path of knowledge, and so they can become engaged in the process. It's more than just us being engaged, but how we bring others into the engagement process as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think, you know, something I wanted to bring up earlier when we were talking about, you know, rental properties, right? Affordable, we have a lot of affordable housing providers on, right? One of the key things that, you know, a distinction that one of our partner organizations that we work with said was that we don't call the people who live in our properties residents, we call them tenants, because tenants have rights, right? And that every affordable housing, especially some of the mid and large size ones, you should have an organizing arm. You should be doing organizing work within your communities, right? Some of these properties provide housing to thousands of residents, right? And so those residents have ownership in their communities, right? And so how are we facilitating those processes, right? And that they are tenants, right? Because tenants have rights, and how do we help inform folks of their rights? And that's community organizing.
Mm.
So Ron, we've had some questions come in. One of them here, how many people are familiar with the Fair Cloth Act passed in 1998, signed into law by President Clinton? Ron, I don't know if you want to comment on that one. I'm not familiar with it, but maybe folks are also, maybe there's some folks that are in the audience that may want to comment on that as well.
Yes. Yeah, I'll take some from the audience, because I am not familiar with that Fair Cloth Act in 1998 by Clinton. Well, I'll take this question here about the CRA. Outgoing controller of the currency had made a proposal to de-gut the current CRA legislation. Maxine Waters has been working in Congress to turn that effort back around. We made comments, a lot of the community organizations made comments early this year. And a lot of those comments that we made during the comment period of the writing of the new legislation for CRA weren't accepted. And so this administration has been very clear on what its objective is. Its objective has been to cut every policy that benefits working class people. And so we're right now still wanting to see what comes out of the Congress through Congresswoman Maxine Waters' subcommittee on economic development, and in terms of looking at some revisions to the CRA law. So she's working to try to turn back this effort around the CRA new proposals. What's the second part of the question? Address the damage done by redlining. I think today, I mean, the damage done by redlining, it has been so so devastating. I don't know if we're ever going to recoup that part of history economically. But what I will say this here, one of the things I've been looking at is, and we've been hearing a lot of conversation around reparations and what that looks like now, and how can we bring some healing economically back to communities that have been, again, Black communities that have been certainly affected by the institutional racism and the structural practices. And I looked at the Marshall Plan, and the Marshall Plan was a plan that was developed after World War II, where the United States rebuilt Europe after the war. And during that time, we made an investment of $16 billion to rebuild Europe in 1948. So I did a simple calculation in terms of what $16 billion would look like today in terms of value. It came up to calculate $160 billion. So there are several plans out there right now. Black Lives Matter has proposed some monetary proposals around reparations or restitution, however one wants to define it. Bob Johnson, the past owner of BET, he's proposed a $14 trillion plan. And I think there's another plan someone else has proposed. But there have also been some proposals by cities. Asheville, North Carolina, Evanston, Illinois, both have developed reparation plans to cure some of the past historical actions that were prompted out of redlining and segregation. So we are seeing some movement from city and local governments to do some reversal of healing some of those past practices that have occurred over the years. Is there another question, Judy?
Yeah, so related to the question that you just addressed is from Laura, who says, I work with local and state governments on affordable housing. They often want to use race-neutral policies and practices, even when they want to focus on disparities affecting Black, Indigenous, and people of color. They get caught up around fair housing laws and other legal concerns focused on protecting other protected groups. In your work or experience, how have you seen communities center race and or address racism in their policies, right? So to your point, Ron, right, like there are a couple of examples now. Asheville just announced they're creating a type of reparations program. Evanston was last year, I think. And so I think, right, we get caught up, or have historically gotten caught up with the race neutrality, but there is now this push, right, that if we're gonna undo racism, right, that you can't do it by being race neutral, right? We have to name racism, and we have to name the specific populations that have been devalued and dehumanized as a result of those processes. And we have to direct resources, targeted, sustained resources to Black communities, right? That is one of the key strategies of the Black Lives Matter movement, right? Is to center Blackness and center the Black experience, and to unapologetically do so. And so in doing that right now, there is, government is starting to slowly respond, but we have to continue to push, right? In our work with organizations, this comes up a lot, where people are asking, can we actually do that? And so sometimes we say, well, you won't know unless you do it, right? That you actually have to try and push, and to what extent that we saw with Elizabeth Warren had a proposal when she was running to target resources or target a home ownership program specifically to communities that had experienced redlining, and that program you would be eligible if you had lived in that community for several years, so that it wouldn't be a situation where you're giving those funds to someone who just moved in a year or two. It wasn't perfect, right? There was still a possibility that it wouldn't, that a Black person or Black potential homeowner might not be able to benefit from that program. But that's the limitation that we have right now in the law, where you can't specifically say, or the understanding or the interpretation is that you can't specifically say that we're going to direct this program or this funding stream to Black communities, right? But I think there is room, like we're starting to hear just even in the past few weeks, right? Mayors saying we're going to, with the calls to defund the police, right? Mayors saying, yeah, we're going to shift some of the money, some of the revenues, and direct that to Black communities. And so there are possibilities there, but there are possibilities, but we don't know what those possibilities are if we don't pursue them, right? And if we don't push beyond the contours of what's considered legal, right? There was a lot of things in this country that were considered legal, but they weren't right. And so I think part of the work that we have to do is to continue to center the Black experience, and that we're never going to move past where we are if we can't be explicit about race and be explicit about the communities that have been historically disadvantaged. And as a result of that, we are going to be explicit in how we direct our funds and resources.
Judy,
Love to see you have something to share with us.
yeah, let me Barbara just gave us some FYI, but I want to just share something. You know, the resource that we're talking about doesn't come into the Black community. It comes into the Black community through organizations. And so we talk about building ecosystems. We got to be able to support organizations in Black communities that are doing the work. The housing counseling agencies, the nonprofit developers, the agencies who are doing small business counseling and financing, the community development finance corporations. These are the entities that are in most Black communities that are missing in totality, in comprehensiveness. And so you may have one of these entities operating, but maybe missing 3 or 4. And so what cities now, some cities are doing now are looking at promoting this equity conversation up into their administrative offices, where they can look at how resources are being allocated throughout their landscape to show some balance, that they're not adversely delegating resources to one area of the city and not to another area of the city. But the other part of this too is what I'm arguing is that the ecosystem has to be strengthened. We do have a Black community development ecosystem operating, but it's fragile. And so it needs more strengthening, just like a muscle. You know, the more you exercise that muscle, the stronger the muscle get. And so I'm saying the more that we can put resources in building capacity in many Black neighborhoods, we will see the results of the strength of those communities. You know, I remember growing up and might have been my father told me that if you want to solve crime, give somebody a job. We can't continue to have high unemployment operating in Black communities and expect the crime rate to go down. It's just not practical. And so we have to be able to address this ecosystem, and it's a capacity issue with resources. And in Richard Rothstein's book, and if the audience, if you haven't read The Color of Law, I would certainly suggest that you read it. It's not a long reading, but I think Richard did a really excellent job of laying out the landscape of how local governments working with state governments, working with federal governments, developed these policies that restricted the movement of Blacks and other people of color. And so there were invisible walls around communities where investment never came in. Your property values never increased. Your access to getting out to better employment opportunities never happened. One of the most recent situations that happened in Maryland, in Baltimore City, in 2017. 2016, when the new governor was elected and killed the transportational network that was planned for Baltimore City. That red line, it had already received $900 million of funds from the federal government, from the Obama administration, and $760 million of state funding. But after his inauguration, he killed the red line, which would have provided so much access for inner city folks to get out to other suburban areas to get jobs and increase their opportunity for wealth. And so if we're not having, again, as I said earlier, this conversation about wealth building, wealth capacity building, how we address the wealth issue, because that to me is the question of this century now. How do we start closing this wealth divide? The average Black family is $17,000 in net worth. The average white family is $120,000 plus. How do we start working at really closing this wealth divide with creating opportunities for educational advancement, opportunities for ownership, that we can advance equity into communities and into families. And And it's, yes, and unfortunately, it's a process. It's not going to happen overnight. We know that, but we have to start to begin to really put practices into place.
Obviously, I wanted to make sure you had a chance. Earlier,
Right.
you wanted to share something with us.
I'm sorry, excuse me. What I wanted to point out was the question was asked about what Clinton did, but the original Housing Act, the Fair Cloth Amendment, that was passed in 1937, and it limited the construction of new public housing. However, in 1999, Clinton signed into law a Fair Cloth Amendment, and that literally prohibited the construction of more public housing. In order to build a new public housing unit, the federal government is required to either abolish an existing unit or sell it to a private buyer. And he signed that into law in he signed that into law in 1999. So not only did you have a housing law that restricted the construction of units for people to live in, but in 1999, he further restricted it. In other words, if you're going to build a new unit, you had to tear down a new unit. If you're going to build a new project, don't get me started on that, you had to tear down an old project. So basically, that kind of brought things to a screeching halt, you know. So I just wanted to respond to that real quick.
Thank you, Barbara.
Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Yeah, and like someone, yes, the storyteller. Yeah, and some would argue, right, like that's a process of disinvestment, right, of government disinvestment, or saying that basically with that what you described is government saying we're going to slowly get out of the housing, be responsible for building housing, right, and starting to create this ecosystem that we see now, right, where even in the affordable housing space, right, can be very corporatized and very private type of approach to developing housing that's meant for low-income communities.
There's an old saying that the devil's in the fine print, the devil's in the details. So a ruling or a law that was supposed to bring people up would be passed in a broad stroke, but then the minutia, the fine print, was slowly stripped, restrain, and neutralize what the original purpose was alleged to have been.
Yeah.
You know, and that's just another example. It's like to parallel it. The Constitution does not say we're a two-party system, but in Southern states in particular, they used to have a law that if you were running as a new party or independent party, you had to have won the majority or certain percentages of the vote in the previous election. But you couldn't run in the previous election unless you had won a certain percentage of the votes in the previous election. You follow what I'm saying? So on the one hand, it's supposed to the ruling was, oh yeah, you can run as a new party, but then the detail said, but you can't unless you have, you know, so many votes from the previous election. Well, how can I have votes from the previous election if I can't run? I just a parallel. I hope I didn't get off course. But
no. Thank you, Judy. We got a few minutes left. Do we want to sort of highlight the sessions that are coming up in the next couple of weeks for the audience?
Yes, absolutely. I do want to acknowledge that there are a few other questions. Unfortunately, we're out of time and aren't able to answer your questions. I'm willing to stay, Ron, if you're willing to stay for a few more minutes after we.
I'm willing to stay.
Okay, great. So for those who have to leave, you know, we thank you for joining us in this initial conversation. As we mentioned, this was a series. The next session is July 29th, starting at 7 o'clock again. Reimagining Black neighborhoods, moving beyond the legacy of white dominant community development practices. We have a session on August 5th, developing urban and rural economic development and wealth building for Black communities. The session on August 12th is focused on reparations. And the last session on August 19th is going to be an open format discussion. And so we're hoping that you'll continue to join and engage with us. There's a great lineup of speakers to be joining us over the next few weeks. And so we're really seeing this as an ongoing conversation and building up to a platform, really, about what are the principles of conscious community development and Black-centered community development. So we encourage you to continue to be in conversation with us, and that we hope we'll see you again on July 29th. So for those that have to sign off, thank you again. Have a great evening. Our website and Twitter handles are listed here. We're going to stick around for a couple more minutes just to answer the remaining questions. And so folks are welcome to continue to be with us for those who can stay on.
Yes, yes, thank you all. Thank you. You want to address that first question,
Baba,
Judy?
you're leaving us?
No, I'm saying thank you. Could I say one small thing?
Yes, sir.
One of my students asked me, what is the biggest hurdle to change? Why is change so difficult? And I replied, one of the biggest hurdles to change is, in order to effect change, someone must give up power, whether the power is imagined or real. And everyone wants change, but no one wants to give up their power. And that feeds into the racism. They want change, but they want to stay in control of the change. And if you're controlling the change, there's no change.
There's no change.
So I just wanted to throw that out.
Thank you, Baba.
And thank you, Baba C. Yeah, we didn't get to go through CURE's racial equity principles, but a key part of our principles is shifting power. We can't have a conversation about dismantling racism if we're not shifting power and amplifying the voices of community, right? That has to be front and center in terms of how we go about doing this work, right? That we're shifting power, we're creating space, and sometimes you gotta, push through, knock down doors in order to be heard. But that is a core principle of racial equity. We're not practicing racial equity if we're not shifting power. So there was a question from Joshua Gray, who's a college student entering a career in community development. Joshua asked, how do you navigate the stark difference between actionable boots on the ground nonprofit work and policy government work?
You asking how you navigate?
Yeah, and so for me, it's the conversation about community voice, right? Like if you're doing policy government work, that should be informed from your connections with community, right? How do you know what you advocate for if you're not in relationship with community, such that, right? Like we know in DC, there's a whole government policy industrial complex that oftentimes isn't always connected to what's happening on the ground. And then this relates to another question here about, particularly receiving funding or even being heard, right? That it's the national organizations that get heard versus the small or grassroots Black-led organizations that often, aren't heard in these conversations or in these moments or when funding streams open up, right? And so part of it is that sometimes we would get inquiries from especially a few weeks ago, maybe about a month or so ago, right, at the height of the protests, right? There were foundations that were popping up saying they wanted to donate. And we would say, who should we donate to? And we would say, donate to local Black-led organizations, local community-based organizations that likely aren't going to benefit from this interest in racial justice and racial equity. The large organizations, they're going to get funded, you know. So there is a there is some misperceptions that need to be dismantled, right? That it's the groups, the national organizations are important, but it's the groups that are on the ground, that are operating on the day-to-day basis that you've never heard of, that need to be supported. You even look at Minneapolis, right? There were groups on the ground, people who were working around defunding the police, rebuild the block, visions in Minneapolis that was already doing this work, talking about defunding the police before the murder of George Floyd. And so when this happened, it was a matter of that they were already doing the work, and their preparation met the moment, right? Such that we're all talking about defunding the police, right? And so, you know, how do we identify and lift up those groups that are doing the work, you know, oftentimes with very little support at all. And so these are, you know, our champions in our communities that need support. And so as we're thinking about how we strengthen our own racial equity practices, how are we consciously looking for those people and those organizations that often don't get the light, that don't get the shine, but that need support.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that you know, the policy work that needs to go on the policy work affects actually all the work. And so I think one of the things I share with community-based, place-based organizations, that they have to get involved in helping to guide policy decisions. Because policy decision is going to affect their everyday being of their work. And if I was a student at this point in time, I would just do some self-exploratory in terms of what my passion is. I wouldn't so much look at on the academia side of it, but what passionately are you driven to do, and where do you feel your passion is guiding you? Because the policy work can operate, yes, for institutional policy organization, or it can also work to enhance the capabilities of many place-based and community-based organizations. This question that Michelle has asked, I don't know if she's still online, Michelle Johnson, in terms of what examples do you have for self-care of our Black leaders working in the community development field, and with all the historical issues and impacts on people of color and housing, how can we support I assume it's these leaders so they do not burn out? I think that, you know, you have to also kind of develop your circle of supporters that you can share with. One of the things I think that sometimes we do, and we can get caught up into as the face of the organization or leaders, is that we work in silos. And so we have to really start to build relationships with others and supporters. I think that a couple of years ago, I tried to put something together just for that purpose, in terms of how do we bring Black leaders together to start sharing across professions to support that we needed in this community development field, because it can get very lonely at the top, as they sometimes say, when you're out there battling by yourself and you feel like you're by yourself. And so I have taken the attitude and perspective that I'm going to be transparent, I'm going to be transactional in terms of building relationships with individuals. And so that's how I came to know Judy. Reached out, she reached back, we had a conversation, and I think that's how you begin to build a support base. Because institutional racism and structural racism just the thought of just trying to work with it and work against it at the level that you are can burn you out, because it can frustrate you spiritually, and certainly it will zap you of all your mental energy when you find yourself in that space constantly having to be on that treadmill and feeling like you're not getting any progress and you're not making any inroads. So I would certainly suggest that you reach out to other Black leaders that you know. You have both of our contact information. Reach out to us. I'm very interested in what you're doing, and I know that we can find some ways to build some bridges around collaboration. So that's be one of my strongest suggestions to you.
Yeah, and I'll just add quickly, right, that we have to create healing spaces and self-care spaces for ourselves as well. We just facilitated a people of color self-care workshop, or did a series of workshops for a housing organization, recognizing the stressors of the past few months, as well as the work that we've been doing on racial equity that started last year, that oftentimes it's on us, right? It's been on Black folks, it's been on Indigenous, on people of color to lead the work around racial equity. And that can be burdensome, but also that even now where there is an increased interest in the work, that can even be burdensome in that, how do you manage all of these? We're getting flooded, you know, on the cure side of, you know, people asking, we need help, you know, we need help with how to be an anti-racist organization. So there's also self-care for folks that feel, because one, we're doing this work because we feel a level of personal responsibility and collective community responsibility. We're going to do the work whether or not people, the folks with money and power care, right? We're going to continue to do the work because, like, that is our mission, that is our duty, to undo this system in the ways that we can undo it as individuals, as organizations, but collectively. Right? Black folks, Indigenous folks, white folks, people of color, we need everybody on board. And so part of this, what I have seen is, particularly with Black leadership and small community development organizations, oftentimes there's a hesitancy to reach out to say that I'm feeling overwhelmed and struggling, right? And so what we don't want is people struggling in silence and struggling by themselves, right? That find a way to reach out, let people know you need help, that you need support, and breathe. Breathe through the day. Breathe through. I mean, just from, you know, sometimes just even pausing.
Yeah.
And say, I'm going to take a couple of deep breaths before I move into the next meeting or move into the next action. Babasi?
Sometimes we have to just step back a moment and take care of ourselves. Sometimes we have to step back a moment because the problem's not going to go away overnight. Sometimes we have to step back and really take care of ourselves. If you take a day off, you take a week off, you know, which has to deal with what do you call it when you assign other people tasks?
Delegate.
Thank you. It's about delegating responsibility and authority, building a strong network of people within your organization. Oh, about local organizations. A lot of times local organizations don't get funded because people aren't aware of them, or people don't trust them because they're not national ones. However, local organizations have something that was not available 20 years ago. It's called social media. And so they can make themselves known by using I almost said the Facebook, by using Facebook, by using IG, Instagram, by using Twitter, by using the other ones, and branching out there and reaching out to other local organizations. And maybe they can they can create a consortium that will funnel monies on the local level. You know, that, and I'm sure the organization's already doing that. But the magic word for me right now is network. Your two organizations network. You know, the more we network, the more resources we have, and we can maybe identify that this organization is going to do that, this organization is going to do that, but we're looking at each other under the umbrella of doing what needs to be done.
Wow, Judy, you know, it reminds me of the George Fraser video that I showed you. collaboration and how we work together. Yeah. I do want to answer to speak to Amber Jones's question in terms of how communities can get a bigger piece of the pie throughout the process. One of the things that happens in this whole process of development is that many communities don't have the capacity or lacking some capacity in terms of how to negotiate their share of the pie. And so that's something that we have to really work at in terms of, again, the question about capacity. Seasoned developers are now, because the cities are gentrifying, are coming into Black neighborhoods, presenting themselves as do-gooders to community organizations, but the whole objective is to get access to land and property and do development. I looked at a chart the other day. 8 out of the 20 top gentrified cities are being run by Black mayors. They're being run by Black mayors. But yet gentrification, as you all know, in Washington, D.C., and Atlanta and other cities, has still progressively moved forward. And so one of the things I would say to community groups in terms of how to get their fair share is to be able to negotiate some benefit agreement with developers. But that takes knowledge, that takes skills. And so if you're a person who don't have those knowledge and skills, what you think may be a good deal may actually be a bad deal. And so, as they say sometimes, don't go shopping while you're hungry. And if you've been in a community that has had no redevelopment for years, you're just happy that somebody has come to say, we want to do a housing development or some kind of other development in your community. You're just happy to see something new because you've been neglected for so long. And that opens up a dangerous door for being exploited. It opens up a dangerous door for being exploited. So one of the things I would say that again, this question about capacity, Barbara was talking about it. It's hard to not get overwhelmed when you are running an organization whether it's just you and a secretary.
Yeah.
And you are thrusted with this responsibility for a community of 8,000 or 9,000 people. You're going to get burnt out because your capacity level is all wedded in you. So not only you have to do the administration, you do the grant writing, you do the operations, you got 10 tentacles that are operating all the time that you have to manage. And what I see sometimes, and that is a recipe for burnout, and it's a recipe for failure. But that's where sometimes we thrusted ourselves into. We're thrusted into those kind of scenarios where we aren't growing because we don't have the capacity, and we have so much commitment and passion for what we're doing, we don't want to walk away from it.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so we stay in that space until it becomes an unhealthy space for us.
Yeah, and this is
life forces us out.
Yeah, this is resonating with me so much. I've been having these conversations the past few weeks, and what we don't want to do is, like, we've seen so many times where, like, there's been an organization that was doing great work and it was basically only ran by this one person, right? Or there may be a couple of people, but it was still this one person, and something happened to that one person, or that one person burnt out, and now the organization is not functional or is non-existent. And so we don't want, we want to stop that cycle, right? Some of that has a lot to do with funding, right? But also that we started off talking about the importance of connecting and being in partnership in this moment, right? So that our organizations can not only survive, but to thrive, right? That if we're thinking about strengthening the Black ecosystem, right, we have to strengthen our organizations, strengthen and support our Black institutions, because what can happen is that you lose all of the institutional knowledge that's been built up within an organization if that institutional knowledge only rests on one person.
Yeah, that's a bad recipe right there. That's a bad recipe when you're the only person who knows? And so, and it's really set you up for failure in the worst kind of way. There's a question here from Rachel, who asked the collective bargaining practice in police and deconstruction of by rules by the Office of Treasury are examples of systematic racism. How systems like these be dismantled? Well, you know, that's a very interesting question in terms of the collective bargaining agreement. I didn't realize it until just recently through the conversation I'm hearing how powerful police unions are. I didn't realize how powerful in this whole process the police unions are in terms of collective bargaining with local government. And so when you talk about now trying to dismantle, and you're not talking about doing away with police departments, what you're talking about shifting some of the resources that they may have to other areas of the community that could be enhanced and could benefit by using more resources, mental health, support services for youth, etc. But this whole relationship I'm hearing now around the police department unions and then negotiating with local governments is one that's now front and center. And so unions are going to have to really work at how they're going to now try to do business with the city on the behalf of their rank and file. Because what has now happened and has been happening has been a result of the rank and file running back to the union when they have done things inappropriately, and the union sheltering them because of their bargaining power with the local governments. And so that cloak of protection has to go away, and the union leadership has to come to the city and really start working at how we build a better relationship. Because this relationship of antagonism and being in disagreement is certainly not one that's working for the betterment of any city and any community.
However, it has been historical. The police, I'm about to open the can of worms. The police have been adversarial to the Black community since paddy wagons. Paddy wagons were the wagons they used. They were run by the Irish, but
I
and they were used to run down, hunt, and confine runaway enslaved people. But that attitude toward the Black community has never changed.
Yes.
I used to wonder when I was in junior high why the program called Officer Friendly. What was the need for it? There was a need for it because the Black community, from historical perspectives, has always been suspicious and not trusting of the police. So you have these programs that say, "Hey, we're your friends." Now, so you know that adversarial thing. It's not something that just happened overnight. The basic difference between what's going on with police misconduct now and police misconduct 10 and 20 years and 30 years ago is something called social media, is something called smartphones. And now they can put those people on blast because you still have police people who are writing up false reports. Well, he attacked us. I thought my life was in danger. When you see that that's not what happened. You know, the police cameras were supposed to work to cut down, but they can turn the cameras off, or they say it was malfunctioning. You know, so the distrust between the Black community and the police department, it's not a 50-50 thing. If you coming into my community from the get-go and we're the enemy, and I've heard countless police tell people you're either blue or you're them, and I hear white policemen tell this to Black policemen: you're not Black, you're blue. It's us against them, and that us against them attitude has to be arrested.
Yeah, you see it, right? There's this attitude that we're going into war. You've seen some of that language, right? That they view police view, you know, the Black communities as places where they go. That's a war scenario for them, right? And so what outcomes do you expect when you're coming into the community in that way?
Yeah, I want to go back to this Kerner Commission report that was done in 1968. One of the recommendations was the need for change in police operations in the ghetto to ensure proper conduct by individual officers and to eliminate abrasive practices. A, police misconduct, including indiscriminate stops and searches. 2, physical abuse. 3, harassment and contemptuous and degrading verbal abuse. B was police departments must develop rules prohibiting such misconduct and vigorously enforce them. This is 1968. They had recognized then, and almost over 50 years ago, what the role police have had in Black communities. But structurally, they've not made any shift and change.
Exactly, which is, why we're here in this moment, right? That
right
now it's okay. We need fundamental change, transformation, and for some people that also means abolishment, because the system can't continue in the way that it is. We're almost coming at 9 o'clock, so I am going to have to go at 9. But there's one question here from Zach that says, to your point about redlining and your earlier points about whether communities of color need more rental housing and thinking about the broader ecosystem, how do you see the role that exclusive white communities have in that dynamic? Often the reason rental housing gets built in places is because they are the only places where there isn't enough political power to object.
I agree with that. I agree with that. In Maryland, the state of Maryland was sued by the local ACLU because of its concentration of low-income housing tax credit properties in low to moderate income neighborhoods, and which were primarily Black neighborhoods. And so the state was allocating those tax credits to developers, and they were concentrating more poverty without income blending, income mixing. If you may know that recently the mayor of DC has said now that she's going to be they're allocating money, and they've been moving affordable housing into other neighborhoods in this city, Cherry Chase and other neighborhoods that had not allowed or near wanted affordable housing in their communities. So I think that's a great thing in terms of mixing and blending and doing some income diversity, educational diversity, cultural diversity. So I agree with the panel.
I agree with her intent. I want to see it played out. I don't want to be the naysayer.
No, I understand.
This is not the first time I've heard a mayor say this.
Yes, I agree.
And the challenge is that the mayor may want it, but certain individuals in certain communities may not want it, and they have deep pockets and they go to Capitol Hill, and that's a whole nother thing, because we're not we are technically, DC is a reservation. It's a federal reservation, but we don't have autonomy. Even though we have something called home rule, we don't have home rule. So there are things that we want to do, but they can get their Maryland or Virginian or somebody else's senator to step in and convene a meeting and session and say we can't do it. Yeah. I don't mean to be a naysayer, but I would love to see it done.
I agree with you, and I think it was like what Judy said, that people have to be able to look within themselves and ask themselves the question: how am I functioning? How do my even small decision add to this racial discourse? And I think that's the question that every individual has to ask themselves. Particularly, my white brothers and sisters, they got to ask themselves that question. because sometimes they don't see themselves as a participant in supporting institutional racism or structural racism. Well, I just did this. But what you did added to more of that negative action. And so, I say this all the time. People there has to be a willingness for change. If you are talking change, you have to have a willingness to do the work that brings about the change that you need to see in yourself. You have to work at yourself. And
people have to be willing to give up power.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Willing.
Or have that power neutralized. Well, and I know we need to go because my stomach is rumbling, and I know we all have things we got to get ready for tomorrow. But before the 60s, Black neighborhoods were very, very diverse. You had plumbers, lawyers, dentists, carpenters, construction people living in the same communities.
Segregated Black communities.
Yes, but but there was a sense of community. People worked together. When I was growing up, there were people. Many thoughts, but I can express one at a time. We looked out for each other, more or less. We had stores and things that we owned, but with desegregation, because we never integrated, desegregation, a lot of us, unfortunately, left and deserted our Black businesses and educational systems, et cetera, because we wanted that white stuff. And even though they didn't want us, we wanted that white stuff. So we let a lot of things fall on the wayside, and a lot of communities that used to be cohesive fell into the wayside. So it's about reclamation. It's about understanding Black folk are multi-billion, if not trillion-dollar commodity, and I don't like that word, commodity in this country. And we're a commodity because businesses know they can get our money and we'll pay like lip service, but not really do anything. That's changing. Slowly but surely, that's changing. We have that economic clout. We can make changes by using our economic clout. And by no longer saying, look, we want to sit at your table. But every time we build our own table, they get nervous. Wow. So building our own table, building our own institution, reinvesting in our own organization. There are a lot of people, there are a lot of rich people, Black folk, investing on the low into Black communities. And they're doing it, I think, under the radar because unfortunately, a lot of times when our stuff gets on the radar, our leaders start disappearing. All that said, we're still doing things. We're coming back. We're rediscovering ourselves and how to rebuild the communities. I did a little research and I discovered that using only monies from Black individuals and Black-owned organizations, the African American community could obliterate poverty within 5 years and could make sure that every child got a college education. We have that kind of financial clout, but it's unlocking that, networking, getting people to want to do that. We can do it. Okay.
I won't disagree. And I won't disagree with that either.
Thank you. Please invite me back. I've enjoyed this. I'll be a regular part of this if you will allow.
All right.
Yeah, definitely.
Well,
I do want to answer, Ron, we should answer Shelley Miller's question before we wrap up.
Okay.
Shelley asked, how do we confront the maldistribution of wealth and result in unequal capital control in favor of the white race in America and around the world? This wealth is the basis of the power exercised to create white supremacy structures. Is it accepted that, my eyes are failing me. Is it accepted that racial justice, especially for Black people, cannot be had without correcting that misallocation of wealth? How can we catch up? Reparations is a mere start that requires just a measure of loss, but what about unfair wealth building in favor of the white race?
I'm looking for the question. Kind of long.
It was over time, 8:15.
Wow, there are a lot of great questions in here. Woo.
Yeah, so obviously reparations, has to be a central strategy in terms of addressing the racial wealth gap. But there have been other strategies as well that has to be and what I'm seeing here in Shelley's question is that it's what's a comprehensive strategy, right? That reparations is one part of this. There was a proposal from Cory Booker and others for baby bonds. The baby bonds proposal to guarantee that I think in his proposal it's anyone, but you would get more if you're at a lower income. And so there's been some research on similar types of strategies where you have this form of guaranteed security, if you will, or of a baby bond that over time that would help to reduce the racial wealth gap, particularly for young Black folks.
Yeah. Only thing I can add to that, it's going to have to come from government. If we're going to economically stimulate Black communities and address this wealth divide, it's going to have to be a government-sponsored initiative. And then, of course, private sector will have could have a role in it, but it's going to have to be government-led. It's going to have to be government-led. In the same way that this government rebuilt Europe, it's going to be the same way that this government is going to have to make a commitment to rebuild and stimulate economically the Black community.
Which comes back to us exerting both our economic and our political clout.
That's right.
And not just wait for national things, but on the local level, building up on the local level, then the county level, then the state level, and then the national level politically, but also concentrating, or at least concentrating our economic wealth. I mean, there is so much money in the Black community, even in communities where they're traditionally called poor or underserved, but you can still do it. I mean, I'm oversimplifying, but that economic and political clout has to be brought to forbear to make those changes happen. And it means that we're going to have to be, good angels?
Well, Bobby, recently, one of the things that's certainly going to impact the Black community, we lost 400,000 Black businesses during this whole pandemic.
Yes.
Yeah, and so we're going to have to, create avenues to circulate dollars back into our communities. Yeah, we're going to have to do some work.
We have to make sure they stay in our community.
Well, that's what I'm saying. Recirculate. Yeah, because I did a research on how long the dollar circulates in the Black community. It's 8 hours.
Yep. That long?
That's all now. 8 hours.
No, that long?
Yeah, well, that long. 8 hours.
8 hours. And a lot of the organizations, even the organizations that say they're about bringing about equity in the Black community, those organizations usually, as you pointed out earlier, Judy, there's a disconnect. The money's going to their coffers, but they don't go into our community.
That's right. Well, Judy, I think we need to go ahead and bring this to a close, and
we need to wrap up. So much more to
last half an hour. Give them a thank you.
On this wealth question too, is there's a couple of cities around the country that are doing these experiments around guaranteed income. That has to be a part of the conversation. Guaranteed income, federal jobs guarantee. So really thinking about the whole economic ecosystem, if you will, to use our word for the evening, in terms of how people bring in income and how people bring in wealth, right? That income is a part of that, but also assets and ownership, right? But if people aren't bringing in enough money, right, to make their basic needs, how do you even begin to build wealth when you're struggling for day-to-day survival? So we are really going to wrap it up. Thank you to our 14, 15 people that stayed all the way to the end. But there are about 30 or 40 people that stayed past our 8:30 closing time. So so I really appreciate the interest. This is important conversations that we're having, and I appreciate the space that we have to kind of just like flesh some of this out, right? And really thinking about this, as you said, Ron, as a kitchen table conversations, but kitchen table conversations have consequences, right? Oftentimes when we're having these kitchen conversations, they're about budgeting and how we're going to afford to pay things. And so we're having this kitchen conversation from the perspective of community, right? How are we going to address these longstanding gaps and inequalities, as a result of structural racism and white supremacy? And so we are just getting started. We have a series of sessions coming up, and so I'm personally looking forward to seeing what comes next in the conversations over the next few weeks, next few months, and then the open format call to action, right? That we're building up. This is a process of us thinking together collectively through these issues, so that we have some clarity about what we need to be asking for. So that was a question earlier about how do we connect boots on the ground to advocacy, right? So this is an attempt to do that, right? That we're bringing folks together who are the boots on the ground, right? To think about these issues and what they mean from an advocacy and policy change perspective and strategy. Babasi, I want to thank you so much again for being a part of the conversation. Ron, thank you for your leadership. Thank you, Sienna from the NDCC team. Thank you, Chantel from the CURE team for technical support. And we wish you a good evening. Be well, and we will see you in a few weeks.
To be continued.
Thank you.
To be continued. Bye-bye.